Hello, everyone. Welcome. I will start the program by reading an epilogue from Rising Up, The Power of Narrative in Pursuing Racial Justice. There is a certain lucidity that emerges when one occupies the status of a minority. I recall feeling it starkly for the first time when I moved from the United Arab Emirates, a country where most people look like me, to Texas, one of the whitest parts of the United States. I felt it each time I leave the multiracial spaces of Los Angeles and arrive in Boston to visit my in-laws. I experience it when I leave the historically Black neighborhood where I live and cross the freeway to the wider, wealthier parts of my adopted hometown of Pasadena, California. The sensory shift that occurs when one moves from majority status into minority is instructive. Because our racial differences, superficial as they are on a biological level, are so visible to us, we often seek comfort in the conspicuous markers of skin color around which we aggregate. I've begun to understand how the white right's fear of becoming a minority, of losing privilege and power, especially in recent years, reinforces racist narratives and structural racism. I can relate to the anxiety and anger, for I often feel it in white-dominated spaces. But I cannot relate to a thirst to dominate. When people of color seek to correct the narratives that have been built up about us, we are not seeking power over another racial group. We are not seeking to bring George Orwell's Animal Farm to life by toppling racial hierarchies only to reproduce them in reverse order. We are seeking a reversal of injustice. We want racial equity. We want a collective liberation from oppression. Eventually, humanity may resemble my sons, two cafe latte colored mixed race children. Already, it's getting harder to discern racial differences in this nation. The 2020 US Census revealed a mass 276% jump in the two or more races population. There's no stopping the transformation of the nation. We are rising up. Black, brown, Asian, Latino, and Indigenous people are reaching a critical mass, expanding our demographic presence in the United States and representing what racists fear when they dehumanize us. But this transformation need not generate fear or signify loss. Instead, it can be seen as a glorious evolution of not just who we are as individuals, but who we are and can be together.
Thank you, Zora, for that beautiful reading. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us for this month's installment of The Political Mandate of the Arts, presented in partnership with the Wende Museum, the Thomas Mann House, and Dublab Radio. We're really happy that you're here, whether you're with us live on Zoom or listening in on air. My name is Emma Larson, and I, along with the rest of our student council, am very pleased to welcome Sonali Kolhatkar as today's honored guest. Over the past 6 months of our program, our council has hosted a series of conversations exploring how the arts and artistically minded people can make a difference in times of social and political crises. Through discussions with visual artists, musicians, dancers, writers, theater and filmmakers, cultural critics, curators, journalists, and others, we have thought about how art can breathe new life into communities, how the autonomy of art can help or hinder times of social stress, and how we, all of us, can play a more responsible role in the world that surrounds us. Sonali, you are a wonderful addition to our list of interviewees. Born with Indian citizenship in the United Arab Emirates, Sonali moved to the United States when she was 16 with the dream of becoming a physicist. That dream became a reality after Sonali received a double BA in physics and astronomy from the University of Texas and an MA in astronomy from the University of Hawaii. A serendipitous turning point in 2000, however, brought Sonali clearly into the world of social justice activism, when she, inspired by the work of the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, began working as a radio host in Pasadena, California. Falling in love with journalism, it seems, from my perspective, Sonali never looked back. Since her start in media, she has been inspired by attempts to understand the societal influences that keep the downtrodden down. She's the founder, host, and executive producer of Pacifica's popular weekly radio program, Rising Up with Sonali, and the racial justice and civil liberties editor at Yes Magazine. Sonali's activist work revolves around her position as founding co-director of the Afghan Women Mission. More recently, Sonali has published a wonderful and timely book called Rising Up: The Power of Narrative in Pursuing Racial Justice. In addition to this all, Sonali is also an award-winning artist who works in a breadth of mediums. Her website also describes her as an avid baker and chocolatier. Today's program is going to feature a 45-minute discussion with Sonali, moderated by Student Council member Meghana Halby. Our conversation will then be followed by a 15-minute audience-driven Q&A led by Amy Cabrales, another Student Council member. Viewers, we invite you to put your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen throughout the program, just remembering to keep those questions as clear and concise as possible. On behalf of the entire Student Council, Sonali, it is a pleasure to have you with us in conversation today. We also extend thanks to Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende. Meghana, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you again, Sonali, for coming. We are so happy to have you today. And so our first question that we are going to start with will be from Amy. And I think Emma definitely said a lot of things about your accomplishments. You are very talented. You have a lot of talent. So there's many ways that you can identify yourself. And so Amy's going to ask a question about one of the main or easiest ways to access like places that you identify yourself, which is your website. So I'll pass it over to Amy.
Thank you, Meghana. Thank you, Sonali, for being here. So our first question, so your website's subheading has the phrase, "The life and times of a well-rounded troublemaker." So as Meghana said, there's many ways to identify yourself, especially when you're such an accomplished person. And it's really interesting to hear and to see how accomplished people, choose a name for themselves. And surely enough, these titles usually, refer to or they reflect important moments in their lives. So what does this title mean to you and how did you create it?
Thank you. That's a great question and such an unusual question. I have several websites, one for my show and then I, keep my art on Instagram, but this is my personal website, sonalikolhatkar.com. And it's a place that I, naturally have to sort of gather all of the things together that I do. And when I was putting it together, I was like, well, I need a section for my journalism and then I should have a section on the books that I've written. Then, I should have a section on the art and I'm a musician and the baking, the cooking and all of that. And, the world we live in today, especially as it's controlled by algorithms and how we feel pressure to present ourselves on social media, makes us want to streamline everything about our lives and reduce us to these one or two things that we do. And my life kind of breaks all of those rules. And so, I'm not just one thing, I'm so many different things. And I don't want to limit myself to just one thing, although of course, first and foremost, I'm a journalist. Like there's a priority of things that I identify as, but I do also identify as an artist. I do also identify as a musician. I identify as a parent and a mother and all of these things. And although I don't write about that on the website. And so a well-rounded troublemaker was one of the things that I thought about as a descriptor for myself, because, when we want to live fulfilling lives, being well-rounded, it can feel kind of overwhelming to, you don't have to be an expert at everything. And in fact, I don't claim to be an expert on anything, but every skill is a journey from starting out as a novice to ending up as an expert. And you never really end up anywhere. You end up honing your craft over and over as you get older and older. And so, well-rounded in the skills that I pursue. And I'm definitely a troublemaker because I'm one of these people who's not gonna, I ask the unpopular questions. We have to be unafraid of doing the things that are unpopular. So in my art, I sometimes, tackle things that are considered sacred. And certainly in my journalism, my goal is to be questioning the things that we take for granted. So, if I'm making a little bit of trouble, that can always be a good thing. There's a phrase, right? Good trouble. So yeah, the life and times of a well-rounded troublemaker was a single descriptor that I could come up with that would encompass these many, many different things that I am and I do. And they don't even frankly include like everything. Like if I really started to list it, it would be nuts. So I just kind of restricted a little bit just artificially. And it's because I'm just constantly looking at like ways to learn things. I can't help it. That's who I am.
I love the word troublemaker. Like, I wouldn't even think that that's like a good way to describe somebody, but I think it's like Congressman John Lewis who said like get into some good trouble. And like journalists, like a lot of people don't like journalists because they expose some bad things. They kind of get up in your business, but that's kind of, I think we've talked a lot on this program about the importance of critiquing our society just constantly. And that's what I think journalists do like a really good job at. So we wanted to delve more into that aspect of your identity, and obviously talking about social issues is very risky. And so Zora will be asking the next question regarding that.
Thank you. And thank you again for being here with us this evening. So this touch more specifically on your social justice side. I did have a question about that because it is evident that you discuss a lot of social issues within your journalism, which I find very inspiring and significant. And as a writer myself, I'm very passionate about like art activism specifically. So I really want to know how I can use like storytelling to uplift like the voices of the unheard. And also I wanted to ask, do you feel any sort of responsibility to do so?
Yes, I mean, that was it. The responsibility to shine a light on the things that people are struggling with is really the only reason I became a journalist. And I think it should be the thing that motivates all journalists. I left a well-paying job at Caltech to do something that I want, that was more meaningful. And I wanted to use the educational privilege I had to make a difference in the world. I know that sounds kind of cliche and a little pie in the sky, but frankly, the point of journalism especially is to strengthen democracy, right? It's not mere fact finding or mere information relaying. It is to strengthen our democracy, because the goal is that an informed citizenry makes better decisions about the direction of their government, their country. The journalism has always been about exposing corruption and abuse, shining a light on power, as the old adage goes, comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. And so I wear my biases, if you will, on my sleeve. I've never tried to hide them. I've always been biased towards social justice, because otherwise, what's the point? Otherwise, you're just a stenographer for the powerful, right? You're just writing their talking points and conveying, and you're being a propagandist. If all you do is repeat the talking points of the powerful, then you are part of their PR campaign, and you might as well be on their payroll. But if you want to be a journalist who uncovers truths that help strengthen society, that help make a difference and change people's lives for the better, then you really do have to feel that responsibility to do the right thing. And the work of social justice-based journalism is necessarily truthful. For what could be truer than the idea that all human beings deserve equal rights? The falsehoods are that some people are superior to others. That's a falsehood. And so those journalists who perpetuate the myth of white supremacy or perpetuate misogyny are perpetuating harmful ideas that are based in falsehoods. So if you're a journalist, you are adhering to the truth and you're adhering to justice. And I hope that you pursue that if it's something that you're interested in. We really need young people to be motivated by these ideas and to strengthen our field of journalism. You're right, it's not one that people trust as much these days, in part because our corporate journalists, our corporate media journalists, and media outlets are part of the problem of America. corporate greed doesn't stop at the door of the New York Times. If the New York Times is a, for-profit institution whose stock value takes precedence over considerations of journalism, the New York Times is part of the problem of the ravages of the predatory nature of capitalism. And so it's no wonder that a lot of people have stopped trusting our media institutions, and we do need to bring integrity back to that, vocation by being very, very truthful and adhering to values of justice and democracy.
Definitely. I think a lot of the things you just said kind of create a perfect transition to the next question, which is about our last program, In Search of the Truth. I think you talked a lot about falsehoods and truth in media and journalism. I think that's a big issue right now with like fake news. So Emma's going to ask a very good follow-up question.
Yeah, as you were speaking, I was like, this is perfect. But yeah, obviously, right, like the goal of journalists, socially actively minded journalists, is to present a truthful narrative. After last year's student council, which was titled In Search of Truth, anytime I hear the word truth in a statement regarding news or journalism or history, a light goes off, and I have to ask the question of, in a world that is so divided, both between different communities and often, unfortunately, within them, how do you as a journalist know when the narrative that you are presenting is the truthful one? Obviously, there are overarching truths such as all humans deserve equal rights, but kind of getting a little bit more specific, what does truth as a journalist mean to you?
So I don't have a educational background in journalism, right? My background is in science. And actually, it turns out that preparation, that educational background was the ideal preparation for being a journalist. And I really kind of wish that more journalists, or as part of journalism school, get some science training, because ultimately science is the search for truth. It's truths about the physical world, right? It's understanding how the physical world works, whereas journalism is about understanding how our social world works and digging away at the truths of our society. You can follow some of the same rules that, say, scientists use in the scientific method to decide whether something is truthful or not. And what scientists do is they take the evidence that they can gather and they come up with hypotheses, and they test the hypotheses against the evidence that they have, and they come up with an idea of how something works, knowing that it's a work in progress, knowing that new evidence can improve their hypotheses. Sometimes it can cause them to throw it out altogether and adopt a different hypothesis in the search for truth. And I really feel that that's something that journalism can and ought to think about and journalists ought to think about when we search for the truth. There are some very basic rules of deciding whether something is truthful or not. And I'm glad you brought up the fact that there's a difference between the sort of grand truths of humanity, such as all human beings are equal, and the nuts and bolts truthfulness of a story. And as someone who's not just a writer, but an editor, I come up with this, and I'm confronted with this all the time. When you make a claim, you prove it. When you make any kind of if I'm editing a writer who's doing a reported story, and any claim that they make, and if there isn't a hyperlink to a reputable source proving that claim, I need to see it. But what is a reputable source? And then we decide, this is where we draw our lines. I just critique the New York Times, right? So does it mean that I think that the New York Times engages in like mass falsehoods about basic facts? No, I mean that they tend to obscure like the grander truths. But the New York Times has highly educated paid journalists. And if they have reported on a fact, I'm going to tend to believe that fact unless proven otherwise. The New York Times has been proven wrong on many an occasion. And we also have some really, really amazing folks out there who do fact-checking work. Again, nothing is perfect. And we have to be careful of that, because there's a lot of people, especially on the left and in social justice spaces, who see one little flaw in what someone has done and completely discount everything. It's like saying, this person died after they got the COVID vaccine. All vaccines are bad. First of all, we have to understand the difference between correlation and causation. Second of all, we have to understand that anecdotal evidence, the difference between anecdotal evidence and mass, how evidence is gathered, whether there are large number statistics or small number statistics. Is it in the margin of error? Is it not? All of these actually scientific principles can be applied to journalism in deciding the truth of something. And again, we all will still occasionally make mistakes. And when we do, as long as we own up to them and say, we had a big error in this thing that we did, and we are owning up to the error, we have new information now, and we are adjusting our hypothesis. As long as we say that, we can keep our integrity, we can keep our veracity, and we have to do that, because the search for truth is an ongoing search. You never arrive at some perfect crystal black and white, distillation of an idea. There is a constant improvement that we can make on understanding things. So I hope that answered the question.
So if like the search for truth is ongoing, do you have like a goal in your storytelling that's constantly changing? And like, if so, is there a certain goal? Does that change across different mediums of storytelling that you utilize? I wanted to kind of touch on this later, but I know you talk a lot about intentional storytelling, which Zora will also kind of ask her question. But like, do you hope to reach a certain audience with your journalism? And like, what does the goal stay constant? Is kind of, I guess, the overarching question.
No, the goal does change, and it depends on, like, for me, it was dependent on the stage of my career that I was at. I look back on my years as a young journalist, and I was so fiercely passionate about things, and I would see an injustice and I would want to report it, and sometimes the anger was the point, and there's a place for rage. And after many years of doing it, one of the things that I realized was that sometimes the anger ended up feeding apathy, hopelessness, cynicism. And then suddenly I realized that if my goal of journalism playing the part of strengthening our democracy is still important to me, then I might be going about it the wrong way in harping on solely about all the things that are wrong in our society. And the corporate media likes to do this too. Right-wing media especially likes to do this. We call it the politics of fear, because it's very effective at getting people hooked in and addicted to whatever it is that you're telling them. If you can get them to freak out, they're going to want to know, what else do I need to freak out about? What's next? Oh my God, look at this awful thing to freak out. And it keeps you addicted to the source and paralyzed in terms of action. And unfortunately, a lot of left media landscapes have gone this way for many, many years. And I've seen it happen where we have this like crisis journalism. What's the next crisis? And if I am, and I found a lot of people who consume that kind of journalism as citizens or stewards of our planet, sometimes end up saying things like, well, nothing's going to change. And when I hear that, all the alarm bells go ringing. If we truly believe nothing's going to change, why are we living, right? So I have changed the way I approach journalism. I'm so excited. My new job that I switched to a couple of years ago now was with Yes Magazine, which is a solutions journalism outlet, and they've been doing it for more than 25 years. And the idea isn't to put a positive spin on bad news, but it is to find the places where people are actually successfully making social change happen, because it happens on small scales all the time, even if we don't hear about it, and amplify that with the idea that that is the antidote to cynicism, showing if there's a model of how people are moving money away from policing in this part of the country, maybe they can do that in that part of the country. How a successful model of, urban planning worked here, maybe it could work there. And that sort of journalism and reporting, I have gravitated to in the more recent years of my career as in the next evolutionary stage. I don't know where I'll end up in 10 years, but that's where I'm at right now. And I really, truly feel heartened. First of all, I feel less traumatized and depressed in general. And I'd like to think that the people who read my stories feel the same way as well and feel more hopeful, because I have 2 kids. I need this world to be around for them. I cannot afford cynicism and hopelessness.
Definitely. I think people take for granted like the importance of good news. Like I think it is important to publish like both like positive changes and like crises to draw your attention. Like both need attention, right? Because you don't want to just constantly be in a cycle of like, oh, everything's bad, it's just going to continue to be bad. Because there's constantly people that are working to make things better, which I think gives me hope. I think in spaces like this, yeah, it's very easy to be miserable, but then you see like all the people working on it and you're like, okay, like change is possible. Like we will definitely get there.
Yeah, we shouldn't be just I don't mean to be saying that we should be painting things with a veneer of happiness, but I'll give you an example. I just did a story earlier this week where there's been this quiet campaign around the country to restore the voting rights of people who have had felony convictions in their past. And all we hear about is Florida and how they're suing people who mistakenly voted because they thought they had the right to vote because the Florida electorate passed a ballot measure that was then overturned. But actually now what's happened is just in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been the sea change around the country where even Republicans and state legislatures are joining Democrats in overturning voting rights restrictions for people with past felony convictions. These are disproportionately Black and brown people. And the reason why a lot of these Republicans are signing on is because that issue hasn't been politicized yet. It's kind of this quiet thing that's happening. And if we look at that story, it's really important to remind ourselves, A, change is possible, B, it is happening now, and C, where do we go from here? And things aren't hopeless. You know, the change is happening. Let's amplify it. Let's shine a light on it, and let's build on it.
Yeah, definitely. Before we like got into the interview, I know you touched on like how you're writing a piece about like the strikes and stuff. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Hollywood, right? Like that's a place where we see a lot of change has been made, but there's definitely more change that can be made. So Amy's going to ask a question a little bit about popular culture.
Okay, this is going to be quite a long question just because I want to frame the context. We all watched interviews about you just to get to know you a little better. And I remember in an interview with the organization Interfaith Communities United for Justice and Peace, you mentioned that, you know, identifying and changing the narratives that exist all around us is important to further the agenda for social justice, since, you know, these narratives influence, you know, how we see the world, how we think the world should be, our political stances, etc. And that then influences our culture and our default perceptions about things, and then that influences our policy. And you pointed to Hollywood as an entity that upholds these narratives, and I definitely agree. I realized as I was older that Hollywood does push these narratives, and when you're a little kid, you don't really realize it, but then you're like, whoa, like that's kind of a really powerful message, especially because sometimes the narratives don't really include the values or the viewpoints held by the multiracial community in their works. But Hollywood also has the power to change the narrative, and you gave the example of same-sex marriage. So again, change is possible, you know, through Hollywood, even though they kind of usually try to instill one type of narrative. And changing the narrative, I think, is very possible. And I've had a lot of discussions with many, you know, Black and brown students at my university, and we tend to feel happy and seen when we have like a popular film and it's like accurately depicting our upbringing and our culture, rather than the not so accurate lens sometimes of predominantly white Hollywood writers. So it's clear that, you know, through film, you can change popular culture and perspectives and narratives that exist in it. But I also wanted to address the topic of changing the narrative within families, because that's a really big part of socialization in our lives. And I feel like when I was talking to these Black and brown students at my university, many of them struggle with, you know, trying to combine what they're currently learning with what they've learned growing up. And so they struggle with the fact that sometimes there exists this pressure to, you know, stay true to your family and their values, even though you're being gradually exposed to new ones, especially in a university setting. So do you think it's possible to preserve the culture that our families and elders taught us, even though sometimes that culture has unfair, unjust narratives?
I mean, that's a question of culture in general, right? Our culture is the product of everything that's come before it, and culture changes based on the things that people demand and do. So why are our cultures the way they are to begin with? They are the way they are to begin with because somebody pushed for them to be a certain way and it became accepted. So I can talk about my culture. I'm South Asian, and we have patriarchy rife through South Asian cultures. And does that mean that all of South Asian culture is bad? No. Does that mean that we should accept patriarchy in South Asian cultures? No. South Asian cultures are patriarchal because there were men demanding to dominate and getting their way, and maybe sometimes women enabling them because they didn't know their own power. And, we have a caste system that's built on top of our patriarchy. And so there are some beautiful things about my South Asian culture. And that culture is what I want it to be. And the people who are in that culture now have a responsibility to change that culture for the better, preserve the things that are beautiful. I'm all for keeping our gorgeous saris and our art and our historical sculptures and our cuisine and our music, and push back hard against patriarchy, casteism, homophobia, religious bigotry, misogyny, every step of the way, and make our culture better. And so there's ways to showcase that in narratives. And I'll give you an example. There's a really fun, sort of light-hearted TV show, Never Have I Ever, right, on Netflix. And it centers on a young South Asian woman. And on the surface, the story is about this young South Asian woman who basically wants to get into Harvard and lose her virginity because she's a high school freshman. And so she's very lighthearted and kind of like a fun for a public audience, for popular audience. However, what that show does in a very sly way is that it showcases South Asian culture through the eyes of its women. So there is the young girl, and then there's her mother, and then there's her cousin, and then there's her grandmother. And the men are present, they're not absent, but they aren't the center. And these women are proudly upholding beautiful aspects of our South Asian culture in ways that very quietly and slyly reject patriarchy, right? So that's a way to do it. And we should embrace that, because if we want to preserve our culture uncritically, then we're doing a disservice to all of the young people, right? Many of our cultures are homophobic, but today, South Asians, I look at my own family, elders in my family 10 or 20 years ago would make homophobic comments. Today, they see it on their own TV screens, because even South Asian TV shows in India and elsewhere are normalizing LGBTQ folks. And so my parents, will talk about, oh yeah, so-and-so isn't he gay? Isn't she a lesbian? Oh yeah. And now it's just like a kind of a thing they notice, and not a disparaging comment or a joke. And so I've seen it change in my own culture. I've seen my culture improve and get better because we've challenged it internally. So
I love Never Have I Ever personally. I'm also South Asian, and my family is, and Davy's experience is more like my parents' is, but I can still very much appreciate it. And I think it's fun because she's an angry woman. She's an angry girl, which I think is awesome to see, because there's also the stereotype around immigrants that we need to be quiet and stuff like that. She really stands up for what she believes, which I can appreciate. And I think, at least for me, being an Indian American, it's you get to decide kind of what you want to pass down, what you want to take, the parts of your culture that you really like, what you kind of want to change or modernize. And I think that's a very special part of how culture can change.
Yeah, we have a lot of racism in our culture. We have a lot of anti-Blackness in South Asian culture. We have a lot of self-loathing for darker skin tones in our own culture. I mean, it just happens, like naturally. I have like people in my own family will be like, "Oh, she's so pretty. She's dark, but she's pretty." And I'm just like, I'm always like so shattered when I hear these things. I'm like, and I have to stop and like tell my members of my family, have you looked in the mirror at yourself, at your glorious, beautiful, dark skin, and I have to remind them to let go of these very destructive, white supremacist internalized notions that we have about ourselves. Anyway, I'm getting distracted.
Oh, I am too. I was like, because there's like issues around like bleaching like skin, right? Like that's something that, like a lot of Indian companies like advertise, but it's like issues that we grapple with in the United States too. So you can like see the parallels of like anti-Blackness and like colorism, and kind of like being able to like notice it and like call it out is like very important, just like to move forward. And like you
But
said,
call it out lovingly. And this is again where I've changed. I used to be so angry and I used to feel like I wanted to call everybody out. And I ended up alienating a lot of people. And I ended up, because when people feel cornered, they dig their heels in. And I have changed the way I approach people. And, I mean, I will draw a line. I won't talk to like, a crazy Klansman. I will draw a line. But up until a point where I feel like we have some common ground. I write about this in my book. It's important for us to learn how to start calling each other in and saying in a loving way, what you just said was very hurtful. And I'll explain, and it hurt me in this way. And I know you want to do better. And here, let's talk about this, and do it privately so they don't feel embarrassed in front of the people. Anyway, I think it's important to start feeling like we can do that, because we need a multiracial democracy in this country. And we have to stop rejecting the divisive, we have to stop rejecting the way in which we are propped up against each other. We have a lot more in common with each other than we think we do. And we have to remind ourselves of that. And if we try and we fail, but at least we tried.
definitely. I want to take the time now to remind the audience that we are going to move into Q&A soon, before hopefully we'll see how many questions we can get in, because we have like a billion. But just a reminder to the audience, because we want to hear your questions too. I would be remiss if we did not mention your TED Talk, which was amazing and very impressive. And so Emma is going to ask a question regarding it.
Yeah, in like doing the research and preparation for this interview, watching your TED Talk really hit me, and I'm sure a lot of people on the council, very deeply, as we're like, in our early 20s and like figuring out what our life is going to be. Something you talk about in your TED Talk, but also in your work more generally, I mean, it's true just in the way you're speaking about changing narratives in your own culture, is meaning. And in your TED Talk, you say that society would be better off if we oriented ourselves towards meaning instead of living in like a rat race of happiness and pleasure. But I'm curious, in your opinion, who gets to determine what is meaningful, both because societies throughout history have valued different things differently, and also individuals in society today find meaning different ways. So in your life, who defines what is meaningful, and how do you recommend that those around you search for a similar sense of meaning?
I think it all depends on what your values are, right? Like we have to define, each one of us do need to sometimes go through a self-evaluation to see what our values are. It's something that we should probably do every few years in our lives, but especially young people, when you're starting out, what are the values that you feel pull you into the things that you enjoy? And by values are not the same thing as interests. Values are the things that literally what you value in life, right? Family can be a value. Your religion or your religious affiliation can be a value. Equal human rights and a belief in human rights is a compassion for those who are lesser off is a value. And if you ask like very rich people who have made their money on whatever stock market or whatever, however they've made it, maybe they've inherited it, and maybe they're feeling a little, defensive about having a lot of money. If you ask them what their values are, very few of them might say, money, power for rich people, keeping power consolidated in few hands, because like really, but they might be acting in a way that upholds these destructive values, but there's a cognitive dissonance with what they actually value in their minds and their hearts and how they're acting. So bringing our actions in line with our values is a really powerful thing and can be very freeing. So first, identify your values. If your values are justice, what are you doing in your day-to-day life to make that happen? And it doesn't mean you have to have a career change. You can have your day job. It can be the thing that either you do by necessity or because you want to indulge yourself because you really love it and you just need money and this is a convenient thing. And it doesn't have to be something that you do as a day job. It can be something you do on the side in your free time, if you have free time. And if you don't have free time, if you're struggling, if you're running in place, then honestly, forgive yourself, because those of us who have the privilege are the ones that need to take the actions and find the meaningful work that we do to equalize our society, so that the others of us who don't have the time, who don't have the privilege, who are struggling, find allies in us, see the solidarity from us. So find out what your values are and try to bring your actions, your world, your day-to-day life in line with those values. If you can, if you're privileged enough to be able to. And if you are struggling, find your tribe and the people who will support you. And, and know that for you, we struggle, right? And it is incumbent on all of us to take seriously making our world better so that we don't have that struggle.
Thank you, definitely. I think a lot of the things you said, this is like a great way to end this portion of the interview. But we still have more questions from the audience, so I will pass it over to Amy to moderate that section, but thank you.
Thank you, Meghna, for moderating. That was amazing. We do already have a couple of questions. I'm going to start off first with Eric. He asked, do you have any ideas about if or why there has been an increase in violence against journalists?
Do you mean in the United States or outside of the United States?
It wasn't specified, but I mean, considering
either
yeah. Or up to you. Yeah.
I mean, there is, of course, a lot of violence against journalists outside the country. There is some of it here. I think if journalists are doing their job right, then they are a threat to the abusers of power, right? The places where journalists are being murdered are the places where their truth-telling has had an impact. And it should be a warning when journalists are murdered, like the canary in the coal mine, a very, very serious symptom of a democracy in trouble or a society in trouble. That's one explanation for it. And there are amazing organizations, reporters, organizations and advocacy groups that call out these dire conditions that some journalists in some parts of the world are facing and rally support to help fix it. But I think that's how we really need to see violence against journalists, right? Like close to where we are in Mexico, journalists are often targeted because they expose power and because they challenge, the government, the state, and the non-state actors who are perpetrators of violence. So yeah, I don't know if that's an answer per se in terms of why it's happening and what should be done about it, in terms of what should be done about it, but it's an answer as to why it's happening.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. Kind of, I guess, related still to government, we have another question from Norman, and he asks, how can culture bloom when the culture is totally controlled by restrictive governments?
again, my counter question would be, are we talking about here in the United States or elsewhere? There are absolutely very restrictive governments where culture is tightly controlled to varying degrees. We experience, people experience that, in places like China, in places like Afghanistan, in places like, but then also in places like here in the United States. In the United States, we have a slightly different problem. Our government, it doesn't control our culture as much as corporations do, because we have just such predatory, unleashed capitalism, right? But culture will find a way, and culture and artists find a way. And in fact, sometimes when you have the strongest restraints is when you have the strongest impulses to bloom. Look at a place like Iran, where you have this highly educated population living under a highly restrictive government, and they are giving their lives in the most powerful, moving ways for freedom. And they do it through art, and they do it through their own cultural tools. So yeah, I mean, the harder you push against cultural workers, the harder they push back, because culture is a weapon. It's what makes us human. And if you try to dehumanize us, humans just tend to fight back. There's a really great book that one of my colleagues, I thought I had a copy of it sitting here somewhere. I don't know where my copy is, but one of my colleagues, Tom Hartman, wrote this book about democracy, the hidden history of American democracy. And one of the things that he does that's really powerful is he looks back at history and shows that almost every species, non-human species, tends toward behavior that very strongly resembles collectivism and democracy. Flocks of birds, schools of fish. There are, it turns out that democracy and democratic behavior is a very, very strong marker of a species' ability to survive. And this goes against Darwinist ideals, which are actually not true. So that's something really beautiful, and it applies to humans. So
yeah, your answer made me think a little bit back about how you mentioned values. And I feel like courage is definitely one of those values that journalists have, because, they give their lives to the movement and to, spreading the truth.
Yeah, I feel that activists are much more courageous than journalists. I want to just take that step because, look, I am an observer and a synthesizer and an amplifier of the work that people are doing on the front lines of battles. I don't often face off against, the tear gas and the bullets and the rubber bullets and the arrests and the police violence that organizers tend to face when they protest. I don't do the nitty-gritty, hard, painful, painstaking long-term work of policy shifting and changing. So thank you for the compliment, but I would defer to organizers and activists who are doing the work that we journalists uplift. And it's our job to uplift the work of activists and organizers and change makers, the ones who put their bodies on the lines. We get a secondary trauma, but it's a secondary trauma.
Yeah, that's valid. Another question from the audience is, do you see journalism as a field as more of an art or closer to a science? As in, do you find the art-science divide to be a binary that we should be breaking down?
Very much.
Really
Absolutely.
interesting question considering your background.
Yeah, exactly. And see, that's the thing is I'm just lucky that nobody, when I was of an impressionable age, told me that you either had to be an artist or a scientist and you can't do both. I'm just really glad that never happened. So I just kind of grew up thinking that it was possible, although art was always something that was more therapeutic for me than vocational. And I definitely didn't consider it as a sole career, just because that's where I fall. But I am an artist and I am a journalist who's driven by science, and definitely journalism is a place where they both intersect with science and scientific reasoning. being the overarching approach to doing journalism, but reminding ourselves that if we actually want people to read the journalism, we have to be a little artistic about it, right? There is an artistry to expression that makes the journalistic work more attractive, that it's, you can just tell the dry facts and nobody will read them, and then what's the point? Or you can make it an art, and you can use creativity to convey it in ways that people may not even realize that they're consuming your journalism. And sometimes that's the best forms of narrative work, is narrative forms where the culture is shifting in a way that you internalize and your values change without you maybe not even noticing. So yes, art and science in journalism, art and science in any kind of narrative work to different degrees. I think journalism is a narrative form where the science approach should be more dominant than the art approach. And like say filmmaking or fiction writing should be one where the art approach should dominate the science approach. But intersections of these two approaches in any form of narrative work is essential. I mean, even when I write a reported piece, I'm trying to be a wordsmith so that I can, say cleverly and in a pithy way and in a punchy way, drive home a point that gives my reader an aha moment, and there's an art to that. And it's fun. I mean, life has to be a little fun. Otherwise, it's terribly boring.
I definitely agree. I feel like, I don't know, I hope eventually this art and science binary isn't so strong, because they need each other. Like, it's not like they're two separate things. If anything, they complement each other. And I feel like it's not healthy to be like, it's only one or the other. Like, no, everything is a combination.
Yeah, I mean, our cultural practices, many indigenous cultural practices look like art, but are grounded in science, right? So many cultural practices about like how we treat nature, how we heal ourselves, may seem like just these like customs that are kind of like cuisines or are creative, and it turns out that they were just something that the communities just kind of practiced because it turned out that it worked, because they used kind of a scientific approach to figuring out how things work, and then they couched it in a cultural a facade.
Yeah. Another question that came up was, can you speak a bit more about your work with the Afghan Women's Mission? What is the status/work of that organization currently?
Yeah, Afghan Women's Mission started out as a volunteer-run organization by me and 3-4 other people in 2000. So 23 years ago. It was before the September 11th attacks, and it was, we found it was people united by their admiration for the work of Afghanistan's oldest feminist organization, RAWA, the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan. They're still active. And our goal right from the start was to have it as a solidarity organization with a very practical mandate, which was to raise money from compassionate Americans who supported RAWA and send that to RAWA strings free to do the work that they do. And so their work is basically educational work. They're a nonviolent organization who believes that education is the best weapon against fundamentalism, ignorance, bigotry, religious extremism. And so our goal was to raise money for their life-giving projects, the hospitals, clinics, training centers, skills training, schools, all sorts of things that primarily served women, but also boys, especially young boys. And we raised, money over the years. When the media coverage goes up, people send money to Afghan Women's Mission, and we pass it on to RAWA. When the media coverage drops, the donations trickle in, and it's really sad. And it was really important for us to not use up any of the money ourselves. And so we're all volunteer run, which of course limits how much we can do because we all have day jobs. So the infrastructure remains. When people donate money to us, RAWA sends us a budget about a project that they're interested in, and we send them the donations, and they send us some documentation for how they've used the money. And that's how we express our solidarity. We never, never, never tell RAWA what to do, how to do it, because they know better than anybody what Afghan women need and how to do it. And so that's the model of the nonprofit work that we, sort of a radical solidarity that we do. And it's still, it's as active in as much as we are accepting donations and passing them on. And occasionally when members of RAWA come to the United States, we might organize speaking events for them, because we also want to raise awareness among Americans of what Afghan women are doing in their country.
Right.
And I'm not Afghan, I'm Indian, but it's just it doesn't matter.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think we have time for one more question, and it's related to who you are as a person. So from writing to radio to activism, it's clear that you're engaged in social justice work through a myriad of lenses. Do you also consider your work with art and music as being connected to social justice?
That's a really hard question. I've tried so much to marry the two, because I admire political artists so much, because it's hard to do good political art that doesn't seem contrived. So I'm a consumer of political art, whether it's music or visual art or whatever, but good political art. But when I do art, it tends to be more therapeutic, and that's just what I've gravitated toward. When the world gets me down, if I paint or if I knit or if I, practice music, I can forget about the horrors of the world for just a moment and engage in a moment of beautiful creation, just because, if I bake a cake, it feels like I've done something concrete. The world outside is burning, but I've baked a cake and it tastes so good. And I've shared it with my community, and we enjoyed the sensual pleasure of the love that went into making that cake, etc. And so for me, that is the role that art plays in my life, because it just helps me cope with being a journalist. But I love the work of people like Fabiana Rodriguez is one of my favorite artists. Musicians, Michael Franti is one of my favorite musicians, and Quetzal, which is this amazing Grammy Award-winning band in LA, who wrote the theme song to my show, who are gorgeous, brilliant, amazing social justice artists, but who are also just actually good artists. I love their work. So that's where my art falls. And I have done art at the level of being in galleries and stuff. Like my paintings have gotten into galleries, and I've won a couple of awards, local awards. I'm in my local art association, Pasadena Society of Artists, Los Angeles Artists Association. I've participated in group shows and stuff. So if it's hard to make a living doing it that way. I have an Etsy page and all of that. It's really hard to make a living. I admire the people who do. It's hard to make a living as a journalist too, but not as hard as being an artist.
Yeah. Much props to all the artists out there. Okay, it seems we've reached time, but Sonali, a million thanks from everyone at the Wende as well. To our viewers, thank you for joining in. It was an awesome conversation. Thank you to Student Council as well for organizing the discussion. I just wanted to announce that our next program will be on August 23rd, and we will be featuring video artist and critical theorist Amanda Beach. And with that, we will close off our July program. Sonali, thank you so much. Take care. Good luck with all the work. And yeah, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks.